Welcome to Irrigating Deserts, Classical Christian Education in Our Modern World. Our featured speaker this evening is David Goodwin, co-author of Battle for the American Mind.
Well, it's good to be with you. I have to say, I have not spent a lot of time in Montana, but now that my daughter teaches over here, it kind of hit me the other day. She drove over to see us in Boise, and I saw the license plate, and I went, Idaho's in the corner of that plate. Don't forget we're here, right? Anyway, the story we're talking about tonight is Irrigating Deserts, Classical Christian Education in a Post-Christian World. So I thought I'd start out with a sort of Idaho story. What do most of us know about Idaho? Potatoes. So I'll give you a little story about how Idaho became the potato state. So the whole southern part of the state is a desert, as you know, probably, if you've ever been over there. And that made it effectively worthless land. And that's why Idaho is weirdly shaped, because it's the last land to be settled in the West because nobody wanted it. And there was this big chunk in the bottom that was a desert. And then along came the miracles of concrete dams and electricity. So in the early 1900s, they put in a few dams and irrigated that desert across southern Idaho. But there was a problem with it. Deserts are mostly sand. And I grew up, by the way, on a potato farm in the center part of that southern part of the state. And I can attest that my dad, when he built our house, he had really good windows put into it, the best that he could get, because the wind blew hard. There were Pella windows, I remember. And every so often we had to go dust the windowsills, even with those really good windows, because the sand would blow in through the windows with the wind. And so that's what the soil that the potatoes grow in is made of, is basically sand. But when J.R. Simplot decided to irrigate the desert out there, or actually the farmers irrigated it, but it wouldn't grow much because there's no nutrients in a soil that has been a desert its entire term. So he found some phosphorus and nitrogen mines over by Pocatello, mined that, put it on the desert, on the sand. And there's a funny thing. There aren't many crops that do well in sand without much loam in it, but potatoes are one. So he made potatoes the thing Idaho is known for, because we could grow them with just a little bit of fertilizer. So that's how we became the potato state, and it related to irrigating deserts. So the next, that question you probably didn't want the answer to. So now I'll jump into the usual speech that I give at these things, which probably are more curious about, is Battle for the American Mind and how it came to be. So I was sitting in my office back in 2020, before we had we even knew that COVID was out there. And I got a call from Fox News reporter. Now, I get lots of these calls. It happens pretty regularly. I've traveled the world with a New Yorker reporter talking about classical Christian education. Ended up next week, I guess, or week after next, I'm supposed to do an interview with CNN. I'm not sure I'm excited about that, but that'll be in Washington. So it's not unusual for me to get these. And I got a call from a guy I didn't know, Pete Hegseth. We didn't have cable at our house, so I'd never seen Fox News really, unless I was in a hotel. And he wanted to talk to me about these two little girls that he'd run into in a diner in North Carolina, who were very well behaved, in uniform, and very sharp little girls. They were like third graders and fourth graders. And the mom said, well, have you ever heard of classical Christian education? And he kind of had heard of it, but didn't know very much about it. And so he was given my name. He called me. And these calls usually take about 20 minutes. And so I went in and told him some things. And he was not, he had said, I'm looking for like a good patriotic education. And I said, well, we're not actually giving them a patriotic education, but all of the founding fathers of this country were educated this way. And he's like, huh? That didn't make sense to him. He said, well, no, I just mean someplace where they say the Pledge of Allegiance. And I said, well, actually, the Pledge of Allegiance was written by a socialist to replace the Apostles' Creed in American schools. And we're going to see a little bit of what he did with that. But he was dumbfounded, and I sent him some scraps of a manuscript that I'd written on this, and he read it and was all in and called me up and said, we've got to get this story out. How do we get this story out? I want to do a Fox News documentary on it. We'll see a little bit of one of those in a minute. How many people here have seen Miseducation of America? Okay, one. So you have to subscribe. It's behind a paywall, but I have a little bit of it here that was actually a cut from the series. So you'll probably be one of a very small group who've ever seen it, if the technology works, I guess I should say. So just by way of kind of getting to that story, when we wrapped up Battle for the American Mind, we had no idea that it was going to become a New York Times bestseller. And not only that, the number one book on the list for about 4 or 5 weeks in the summer of 22, sparked conversations all over the country. This Miseducation of America that we'll see here ended up being the most binge-watched show on Fox Nation. So they wanted a second season. We did a second season of it. We did 2 live summits that were aired on Sunday night on Fox back in 22. And at the end of all of that, Pete said, we got to get your book published. I'll call. I told him no one wanted to hear from a no-name author. And so he said, well, let me give you my agent. He'll get this figured out. And just about that time, COVID had put a crimp on paper. There was no paper. And so the publishers were not taking on new authors. And so couldn't sell the thing. So you wonder what God was doing in his providence. Pete said, what if I put my name on it? And the guy said, oh, well, heavens, you're famous. They'll publish that. So he very generously offered, but didn't push me. He said, I understand, So we ended up deleting about half of the original manuscript. So the original manuscript covered the progressives and their takeover of the American public education system, or the creation of it. And it covered the church and the complicit work of the church in the 19th century. So we took all the church stuff out and just kept, the progressives in there. And that became this book. That gave us enough room for Pete to write a fairly significant part of it. So that's how the book came about. And then when they were done, Pete, for some reason, wanted to write a book on War on Warriors. And so he was contracted through Fox to do that. I think in retrospect, I know why. But at the time, it was like, okay, well, you're your own man, go for it. And so he said, you do the follow-on. And so I just finished Forging the American Mind. It's on Amazon, but it won't ship till April. So it is a field guide to classical Christian education. So it's intended for parents or educators, anybody who wants to understand what classical Christian education is. It is radically different, and that's something that we're going to have to get through this evening and see how radically different it is. So it was those pictures that I sent him. Now they found the footage. I only had still shots, but they actually found the footage of the Bellamy salute. So believe it or not, about 1890 and 1942, that was the salute that they did every morning in American public schools. And you can imagine why Congress ordered its termination in 1942. The date might give you a hint. What was hidden in this whole thing is that the progressives set out to change America through its schools. Now, we all probably saw in our schools growing up, I may be a little older than some of you, but some of the schools I grew up in, the American history had a progressive chapter in the textbook, and there was a little green box in the textbook that said, the progressive education system, and it talked about teaching immigrants who were coming to the country and how got children out of child labor, and they were just painted as heroes. But of course, to the victors go the spoils. They tell the stories. They didn't tell you the real story. And I found out about this story because in I don't know, probably 2005, I was at a Hillsdale lecture where somebody read a quote from the New Republic, which was the progressive activist magazine that began publication in about 1914. And I was reading, and this stuff was printed in 1915. Now, if you think about it, if you put yourself back in time with the progressives, it's a new kind of thing. It was kind of confusing because Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive and so was Woodrow Wilson, but they were pretty far apart politically, at least on socialism and those sorts of things. And so progressivism was still trying to find its own. But what it really was an amalgamation of Christian social gospel mainline churches. These are the churches that have now gone very liberal. Most of them are pastored by gays or lesbians or women or something, who knows. But that group of churches was instrumental in the formation of one half or a big portion of the progressive movement. The other half were atheistic socialists who were Marxists. John Dewey was in that second category. And so what I did one day was I thought that quote that the Hillsdale professor used talked about the plasticity of the child, and I got a little bit concerned. That sounded, the quote itself was that they didn't want parents to have influence on the plasticity of the child. That seemed, plasticity, of course, is a word that means formation in some sort of the shaping or the forming of something. And so I went to the library to find this quote because I wanted to see the whole thing. And they brought all of the magazines out in a dust pile, literally, on the fourth floor of the Boise Library and landed them on this desk, and I started going through them. And one thing that I found out is that I thought, the way I'd been educated, that the progressives were all about labor unions and the National Labor Relations Board and saving child labor and doing all this other work to make the world a great and wonderful place. But they had this repeated drumbeat throughout every 2 weeks of publication of education, education, education. John Dewey was writing in a lot of these, as was William Wirt and a bunch of other progressive educators. And it had an entirely different tone than what we were told. Because when you think about it, if you go back in time, a publication, when it very first starts, is really has low circulation, and it's only going to the true believers. So they feel like they can be pretty honest with each other, right? So they're circulating in the New Republic and this other one called the La Follette Times that originated out of Wisconsin, but it later became the Progressive magazine. They were circulating their ideas and trying to basically manage the progressive movement through the publication. So they didn't hide what they were doing. And I was entranced for about 4 hours scanning articles, realizing these guys knew what they were doing. they were trying to take over the hearts and minds of kids. And it wasn't about child labor or anything like that. There was something sinister underneath it. But I'm not a scholar. Some of you may have seen in my biography, I worked in the tech sector back before 2005. I have an MBA, not a PhD. And so as I was looking through these, I was thinking, there's a story here. Somebody must have told this story. And so I'm packed up. The library's warning us that we have to get out. So it's 5 p.m. on a Saturday. So I head down towards the elevators, and there's a little tag sticking out from one of the bookshelves that says education on it. And so I swung in there, and I thought, well, if they come find me up here, they'll kick me out, but I'll figure out if there's anything that anybody who's written about this. And I look at the whole, category of shelves here, and I start pulling things off. Diane Ravitch, I don't know if you know who she is. She's a history writer on education. That just a bunch of people like her, just right and left. And I thought, is the only people who've ever written about the history of education in America progressives? Because everything on the shelf was progressive. Now remember, guys with MBAs, we read articles, not books very often. And when we read books, we don't read thick ones. And so at the bottom, on the bottom shelf, were 3 huge, thick books that said American Education on the spine. And I thought, there's got to be something better than that, something quicker than that anyway. But I pulled one out, and it had a Pulitzer Prize stamp on it. And I thought, oh, this is fairly serious. It was written by a guy by the name of Lawrence Kremen. So we're going to go into what Lawrence Kremen and the thesis he has in this 3-part series. It's about, I think all told, it's somewhere in the 1,500 to 2,000 pages between the 3 books. But he details every corner of American education. Lawrence Kremen's a preeminent scholar, not a conservative and not a Christian, just a scholar who was at Columbia University in New York in the education college, but he was a historian. And so I've later found him on a number of academic shows on PBS and others talking about education in the 1980s and 90s. But we'll get back to him in just a moment and what these books taught me that were down on this shelf. Right now, I'm going to tell you the story that Pete and I tell in the book. We talk about, so one of the great things about writing a book with Pete is that Pete kept, we would get on our calls. We worked pretty closely together on this thing. And he would come to Boise and we'd spend time, or I'd go and see him in New York. And so we'd work on this thing, and he'd go, Dave, you got to get this on the bottom shelf. All this Greek and Roman stuff, it's not where our audience is. Because at the time we were working on the documentary, not the book. And so we got to get this on the bottom shelf. How can you describe what happened? And so I thought for a second, and it was just kind of a impulsive thought. You know, those spy movies or those secret theft movies where you've got it's kind of like the Louvre got robbed here a few weeks ago, some kind of grand scheme where some super thieves go in and there's this precious diamond on a pressure plate, and it's cameras and alarms everywhere, and they got to figure out how to get this out of there without it being missed. So they swap it for a piece of cut glass, right? Well, the thing about Paideia is that it was very well known and understood. If you do an Ngram search on it, you'll be surprised at how much it was talked about back in the day. But so people knew about Paideia in 1900, and it wasn't something that people had thought of changing, because it's just the way we've always educated in the West. And again, we'll come back to what Paideia actually is in the moment. We'll talk about it. But what the progressives realized is that in order to get political control of this country, they had to control the hearts and minds of kids. And that was through this thing called Paideia. And right now, what we're going to watch is a little video that was part. This is the deleted scene that was taken out. I think it was a bit too heady for the Fox audience, but it describes what paideia is and where it came from. The reason this is important, the reason this is important for your kids, and the reason it's important for the nation, and the reason it's important for us to know, is because paideia is what made the West. And we may look around this place, we see exit signs, lights, chairs with pads on them, cars out in the parking lot. The only thing keeping us from being in a mud hut down by the river, freezing our tails off all winter, is the West, right? Western civilization has no parallel. It doesn't even have a close equal. It, by any standard, we way underestimate what we owe the West. And this is how it got started. We're going to cover that tonight as we go through. The reason this is important is if we lose this, now that all of this power and technology has been created in the West, it's going to create a moral deficit that will make any past, in my opinion, any past historical evil pale in comparison. We've already seen it some in the 20th century, the wars that we've fought that have killed far more people than all the wars in history put together prior, right? So we've seen how evil the West, this power that the West has been given, can be. And it's incumbent upon us in this generation as Christians to bring back the paideia that created a good West in the first place. So we're going to watch this little thing on paideia itself. So that's the basic story of how paideia was discovered. The Greeks were trying to hold together a republic. They had to educate people as the education systems that had been universal prior to that time were all what is called servile education. It means you bring the kids up in whatever assumptions and whatever knowledge your tribe has, and then they grow up to support the god of the tribe, who is usually the king, which is why there's so many demigods in the ancient world, as the king always claimed to be a god, so that the paideia of the children would bring the people to follow him in sort of a servile way. The Greeks brought in this idea that if we want to form a democracy in Athens, we need 1,000 kings. We need everyone to be able to think for themselves and not be sucked into the lies of a tyrant who's trying to rule things, right? So they created the 7 liberal arts in Greece. Now, it took a little while for them to settle out into 7. There were, more or less for a little while, but basically the 7 liberal arts, those were passed into Christianity, and we'll see soon how Christianity took those and created an engine of paideia that made the West. So as we look at paideia, these verses that are up here are all in reference to paideia. Now, the ones in yellow actually use the Greek word in the text for paideia, but disciple is also a word that often it means is related to it. It's paideio or one of those. It depends on where you're translating it from. But this concept of paideia, that when in Ephesians 6, when it says, "Fathers, raise your children in the fear and admonition of the Lord, and the education and training of the Lord, in the upbringing and the discipline of the Lord." All of those words are an attempt by the translators to translate one word in the Greek, and that word is paideia. So the Christians from the very beginning knew that the task of every Christian should be cultivating their children in the paideia of the Lord. That's what the task is. Why? Well, because Christ came, died, was resurrected, and then could claim that all authority on heaven and earth was given to him, and to disciple the nations meant paideia, shape them into Christians. That's what the command was. So what we see, there's the Greek word, is, I'll just kind of simply define paideia so that we can understand it a little bit. Simply defined, it represents the deeply seated affections, thinking, viewpoints, and virtues embedded in children at a young age, or more simply, a rearing, molding, and education of a child. So with this feature being so well understood prior to 1900, now we can start to put the pieces together. I could start to understand why it was that all those magazines were working towards the paideia. They were very clearly working towards controlling the paideia of children so that they could change away from a progressive, or away from a Christian view to a progressive view. Now, when Pete originally called me, he said, yeah, everything went to pot when we took prayer out of the schools. And that was one of the points where I said, well, actually, that was just the final death throw. I mean, the real damage was done in 1915, but the project dates back to the 1820s. He was surprised by that. So here's a quote from Orestes Brownstone in 1859. Now, Orestes had been part of the movement attempting to transform American education. Horace Mann started the American public school system in the 1840s, a little before that. And he was doing it right in conjunction with this group who set out to take over the American mind. That's what they set out to do. So as we see this, our great object in the hour here was this group of people who formed the early American education system. Our great object was to get rid of Christianity. The plan was not to make open attacks on religion, but to establish a system of state. We said national schools from which all religion was to be excluded. Our complete plan was to take the children from their parents at the age of 12 or 18 months and have them nursed, fed, clothed, and trained in these schools. The quote goes on and basically outlines how they plan to do it, and with compulsory education, et cetera, and they achieved all those things by 1900, just in time for the progressives to say, great, we'll take it from here. And they built the socialist Marxist system that is America's education system today. We don't think of it that way, and we may not actually realize just how much of this assumption is out there. And that's what we're going to cover in the remainder of this evening, is why this false piece of glass. So the first piece of glass that they put on the pressure plate to replace the diamond was called, Pete and I called it the American paideia, or the American progressive paideia. They knew that they couldn't just take Jesus out of the classroom and put Karl Marx in it. That in 1900 would have gone over like a lead balloon, right? So what they did is they put George Washington on the wall. They put a flag out front. They put flags in the classrooms. They started the Pledge of Allegiance. They taught patriotism. That was the replacement for Christ. That didn't happen until 1915 to 1925, right, in that arena there. So that was their goal. Was it just because they hated Jesus? Well, maybe. I think we could see that could be one reason. But I think there's a much more honest reason to look at, which is they wanted power. And the only way they could get power was to get Jesus out of the classroom, because they could return America to what? A servile education that the Greeks had pressed out 2,000, 3,000 years before. So they wanted to teach our kids stuff, math, geography, literature, blah, 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 right? Stuff. So they changed the school system into a programming system. It just programmed kids in knowledge, but the knowledge happened to be the knowledge they wanted to give us. And there was no attempt to do what the Paideia education had done. And we'll look at that in a minute. But before, I've got one more quote for you here. This is Charles Potter. He is the first president of the Humanist Foundation in New York, and John Dewey and Potter worked together and wrote the actual Humanist Manifesto that was released by this organization. And of course, you may or may not know, John Dewey is considered the father of modern American education, right? So you can read the quote. Charles Potter, John Dewey, they all knew that if they could get control of the American public education system, they could transform the country. And they could do it because we didn't have enough days in the week to counter program them. So for parents today who send their kids to public school, again, we're going to look at it here soon, but the problem is in how bad they are. This is usually what we're measuring, right? Oh, math scores, reading scores. How bad are these public schools? The problem isn't how bad they are. It's their nature. Their nature is to train servile citizens who will do what the king says. It's ironic that now it's always the left who transposes things, right? They're accusing the right of being kings. Well, the people who brought back the king in the sense of the ancient servile education were the progressives by intention. So remember that big book that I didn't want to read that was on the bottom shelf? I opened it up, read through the first book. It was a fascinating, in-depth assessment of what early colonial education was about. Second book, midway through, modern education, bing. He completely reveals what they were up to. And here's the quote. If education was to be the principal engine of an intentionally progressive society, then the politics of education would have significance far beyond the control of schools or child-saving institutions or communication organizations. In the end, it would hold the key to the achievement of the most fundamental of political aspirations, in effect, the key to the American Paideia. So this is the preeminent scholar on the history of American education, widely recognized, Lawrence Kremen. He draws this conclusion. So it's not David Goodwin or Pete Hegseth. It's backed up by guys who really know their stuff. This is what they were doing. So when we send our kids to public schools, when you think about it, just put a little bit of, step back and pretend you're from Mars. All right. You're from Mars and you come here and you go, okay, you've got a republic. The goal of the republic is to self-govern. Who controls the schools? The government. Well, the Martian is quickly going to see, well, then there's not going to be self-governance for very long, right? If the people who want to stay in power control the schools, what do you think's going to happen? It's not rocket science, right? But we just kind of grew up with it, so we just don't even think about it. So the question I wanted to answer tonight, this is all kind of prologue, just to say, hey, we had something precious taken from us. But usually it is at this point where people ask me, so what is it? What is classical Christian education that did this thing called Paideia? How was this Western Christian Paideia, as we pinned it, created by this thing? So that's what we're going to do in the next few minutes, is we're going to go through how classical education creates Paideia. And the very first thing that you have to do is flip a switch in your mind, because it's very likely you, like me, believe that education is about information. It's about how we learn stuff like math and reading and history and logic and all of this stuff. That is not classical education. Classical education trains students in the art of knowing, or in the art of learning. That's why Dorothy Sayers' essay all those years ago that spawned this movement was called The Lost Tools of Learning. She meant that they were lost in the sense that we forgot that you actually, before you learn something, you have to know how to learn it. And I remember when I was first in this movement, I thought, yeah, that's kind of obvious, right? I know how to learn. You learn how to read. And they were talking about things like grammar, logic, rhetoric. Grammar, yeah, grammar. I can read. We teach grammar in the public schools. No. What they were talking about is something that the eggheads call epistemology, right? What is epistemology? It's how we know things. Epistemology, I would submit, is the single thing that makes a civilization. Now, there's a worldview underneath. There's all kinds of other things that make a civilization, but a civilization is fundamentally how they know. How did the Aztecs know what they knew about the calendar? They had a complex system of knowing that involved soothsayers and star readers and sacrificing children and sacrificing adults. And you can say the same for just about every civilization that ever existed. The Eastern civilizations of Asia were probably the most advanced next to the West, but they still had the same thing going. It was an epistemology based in some kind of tradition of paganism. And when Christians invented the term pagan, this is what it meant. It meant that they thought like pagans, right? That they thought like these people who didn't know how to know things. So epistemology is what Christianity contributed that created the West. Epistemology tells us two things in the Christian side. How do you come to know things? Mainly, how do you know truth? And how do you conform to that truth? Because we uniquely in all of history as Christians believe that Jesus Christ was the way, the truth, and the life, right? So if you're going to find a way, you have to know what the truth is and you have to conform to that truth. And that is how you make education holy or set apart for God. That's what we do with education in the classical Christian world. So how do we do that? One way, I'm going to go real practical here because this is chapter 10 of the book. No, actually, chapter 10 of the book, I think, is what has been told by others to me, a very good, succinct description of classical education. I'm not going to go into that. This one, I think, is 8 or 9. This is how, if you look at what the progressives did to education, what would the symptoms be, right? If you're a doctor and you're looking at a patient, what are the symptoms? Because that can sometimes give you a real clue to what they did. The first thing they did is they tore down 4 battlements in the 4 corners. This first one is really interesting, reason. It's interesting because, of course, rationalism or reasoning in the 19th century became God, and we're going to see how that worked out in just a minute. But reason is the first battlement, is the last battlement to fall. I've got them in reverse order here. So the last battlement to fall of the 4 corners was reason. We saw it fall in the late 90s. I pin it to the time when the SAT quit teaching quit testing verbal reasoning and quantitative reasoning. Now, this is kind of another egg-headed thing, but basically, because race and nationality had some kind of correlation to verbal reasoning and quantitative reasoning, which, by the way, is not entirely, as we were told about whites, because the Asians have us beat in several of those categories, right? So us being, Europeans. So it's not about race per se, it's about the culture that underpins it that affects reasoning. And with that cultural effect on reasoning, the SAT was changed in 2000. Well, David Coleman took it over. He later built the Common Core. The point was teach stuff, don't teach reasoning. Right? Teach stuff, don't teach reasoning. And that's what the Common Core is. It's stuff. It's not bad stuff. People looked at it. I was asked to review it for a bunch of different organizations back in the day when it became a popular thing. It's not bad stuff. I mean, there's some bad stuff in it, but it's really just pretty basic stuff. And it's that, again, it's that pressure plate thing, right? They threw Common Core out there. Well, what you did was you used Common Core to take reasoning out of the college equation. So that's when it fell. So we'll go on to the next one here. Virtue. So virtue, what the character education and all of this is still popular in schools. They talk about it in public schools. Of course, what virtues they teach. We talk about virtue signaling. It's really pseudo virtues, right? They have their own set of virtues, and they're kind of weird. What virtue is simply living out according to the truth and the goodness and the beauty of reality. Living out your life in that way. It's the right ordering of affections. It's loving the right things and hating the bad things, right? That's what virtue is. It's about affections. It's about love. We think that we can train kids, what's the NBC slogan for their little character campaign that they ran for years? The more you know, right? The little star would go across the screen, the more you know. They think you can just know virtue. You can't. You have to love it. You have to love the right ordering of it. Kids don't. You can't put a silly poster on the bathroom wall that says, be nice to your friend, be nice to others, and get them to love anything. At some point they rebel against it, and we're seeing some of that go on the internet right now, right? I mean, the loss of character is because they forgot what virtue is. Virtue is loving things in the right order. You love things by what? Stories. If you grew up reading C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, you're going to love different things than if you grew up reading the golden, what it was, I try not to remember the progressive books, but they tried this a little bit. Anyway, it's virtue is deeply set in us by the stories and the narratives that we believe and we engage in. That's what classical education uses classic stories so much for. The third battlement that fell was beauty. This one's pretty easy to see. Now we're going backwards in time, right? Notice how architecture got suddenly ugly after the war, after World War II. Everything's ugly after that. I don't know. Mid-century modern architecture had some value to it, I think, a little bit. It's not my thing, but I think you could say that there was some beauty left in it. But as the Christian paideia drifted out of culture, beauty disappeared, and we got ugliness. And our kids go to school in prisons. I've got 3 public schools built in the last 20 years within a mile of my house, and they all look like prisons, right? So beauty was taken out. And the last one caught our editor off guard when he read it. Wonder? You classical educators, I thought you guys were hard noses. You actually believe in wonder? Well, it was a classic. So it was a Greek who first said all education begins with wonder, right? The wonder that we try and instill in students is a desire to know. What good is the ability to, through epistemology, learn truth if you don't really care, if you don't have a wonder to pursue truth? So these are the 4 things that you can see clearly were taken out of schools. Our schools don't focus on reason anymore, or virtue, or beauty, or wonder. None of these things are left in the schools. That's the ruins that are there. So we can see the progressive takeover. I'm going to jump ahead here. This all began essentially with a narrative that came out in this narrative. There's a competing narrative, and stories kind of create what might be called meta-narratives, the sort of the way we believe the world is. The history of the world was defined by the progressives in these 2 opposite ways. You can kind of see this kind of clumsy graph here. In 1860, That's right, 1860. So this isn't very long ago in long terms. Humanists, a particular humanist, wrote an article where he said the story of the world is this. The world was dark and barbaric, and along came the Greeks and the Romans. And they discovered that humans could know things. And this ability of humans to know things, he called humanism. Well, it had been called humanism slightly before that, but he identified the engine as humanism. And then the Dark Ages came in the Middle Ages, where religion and superstition suppressed human knowledge. And all of a sudden, the Renaissance popped up. What is the Renaissance? It means rebirth. The Renaissance was the rebirth of human knowledge and human learning and all of that. And that is the story we were all told in school. And then the Renaissance, of course, bounces along and leads to the Enlightenment. And in the Enlightenment, the key marker is that humanism does not need God. It can find truth just through rational inquiry. And so this is the story we were all taught. I think it's all of us, it's the only story we know. Well, the story of Christendom is actually quite the opposite. That's what we see with the other one here. So this is classical, Dark Ages, medieval, Renaissance, Enlightenment. Not true. The truth is the classical pagans figured some things out because God in his providence taught the Greeks and the Romans, or allowed the Greeks and the Romans to develop this knowledge just as Christ was coming into the world. At the Ambrose School, the question for the 10th grade year, our entire curriculum is based in questions. And so the question for the 10th grade year, the overarching one, is how did God prepare the world for the coming of the Christ? And that was the development of Greece and Rome and the Hebrews. Those three cultures formed the threads that Christ tied together, and we call those the golden thread, and I'll talk about that here in just a minute. So those classical pagans led to the rise of Christendom in the Middle Ages. And then as the Middle Ages, as people threw off Christ, things declined. Now, when you talk to modern people about this, they go, oh, that's not true. Why isn't it true? Because so many of the scientific discoveries happened after 1850, right? Medicine finally became helpful instead of harmful after about 1850, right? We got cars, trains, planes, automobiles. We got elevators and tall buildings and steel structures, all of this great science and technology. If that's how you measure greatness in a civilization, then certainly that does seem to be that things went uphill after the Dark Ages. That's the top graph there. The bottom graph is the way Christians should see it, because we shouldn't see things in terms of the power of our technology. We should see things in terms of the goodness of our institutions and the goodness of our people. So when you look at that, let's go back to the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, they invented the university. So we think of this, we accept this now, but the university did not exist before the first one was created in 1080 in Bologna. And what created it in Italy was a monastery joined up with a legal team to work on canon law. And the theory was, we're using Roman law to govern a Christian civilization, and the Romans weren't Christians. So why on earth would we use Roman law to govern ourselves? Let's take every thought captive to Christ, every thought captive in obedience to Christ. Let's have the monks speak into the law and form what became the canon law. That canon law became the basis of Blackstone's law, which became the basis of America's law. I'm reading an interesting book right now. It's a great book. Many of you may have read it. It's popular. It's called Dominion by Tom Holland. He has a great quote in there where he says that the leading line of the Declaration of Independence is observably false when it says that we find these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights. Holland proves in his book that that's a falsehood. There's no other civilization in history that ever thought that. That came from this group and the canon lawyers, figuring out what every citizen was owed, regardless of their status. All comes from there. So even our Declaration of Independence is flawed because it assumes too much. It assumes stuff that is Christian is not, and that's not the case. So we look at these other things, private property and capitalism. Who would have known that those were a product of this medieval time period from about 1050 to about 1300? I can go into these, but I don't have time, so I'll just go through it. Parliaments. So people, the founding fathers fancied themselves as Romans, right? We know that if you look at the architecture in Washington, what have you. So we have a Senate, but the Roman Senate didn't legislate. It was nothing like what our Senate does. Our Senate is like the House of Lords, which is a descendant of Parliament. This time period is where they invented parliaments. I talked about canon law, music, art, and architecture. It's funny. We have things like words like Gothic architecture for this time period. Rodney Stark says this is one of the biggest misnomers. This is an entire creation of Christianity, not the Goths. The cathedrals of the Middle Ages are a product of the art of Christians because of this process of epistemology that we talked about. Modern banking was invented in this time period. Hospitals, many of you may know that the Hospitalers, which were one of the knight groups, formed those. Cathedrals, logistics. So it turns out all the institutions that matter were built by Christians. And those institutions are now being used by atheists to try and suppress Christianity. So if you look at, this is just, I don't have time to go into this, but this is sort of a proof point of all of those things, the sources of all of the things that I just showed you on that prior slide, the people who created them. So I call this all the product of the golden thread. So we'll wrap up here. The golden thread is classical Christian education. Yes, Western civilization was created and sustained by classical Christian education. That is a point that very few people understand because you think of school being something for little kids, but it's a civilization building thing. Now, it matters for every kid. It does, because it shapes the hearts and their loves and their desires and their virtue, but it's really a function that establishes civilization. So what is this golden thread? We'll go through this really quick just so that we can wrap up here and go to the Q&A. So medieval liberal arts, grammar for the Romans and Greeks was a little different than grammar for the Christians because the medievals were very symbolic. So they believed, I mean, obviously, if you're going to talk about the heavens and the earth, if you're only going to talk about the earth, then grammar can just be a pretty basic thing. Just state it, make scientific statements about how the stars cross through the skies or how, whatever you observe, just state it. But the medievals believed that the heavens were far above us and symbolism. So that's why their cathedrals are made with very precise dimensions of heights and widths that are divine dimensions that they were pulling out of things. So they really expanded the meaning of grammar to deal with how we convey meaning through words is really what grammar became for them. They also changed dialectic and rhetoric. These are the other two. So if you don't know classical education, these are the trivium, which incidentally, a lot of people think the trivium came from the Romans and the Greeks. It didn't. The word trivium came from this time period when they defined the three ways. That's what trivium means in Latin, the three ways. Three ways to what? The three ways to knowledge. So there were changes to the dialectic and the rhetoric. What happened was Christians started sitting around, and instead of arguing against each other like the Romans did, they started talking among themselves to find the truth. Come, let us reason together, as Isaiah says, right? So this is what was happening during this time period, and this is what we're training kids to do in classical Christian schools today. Theology became the queen of the sciences. We credit this to Anselm, St. Anselm, about 1080, 1090. He's the one who said, it's not that I know stuff so I can believe. It's I believe in God so that I may know, right? So that was a principle that the first thing you have to have before you can attain knowledge is a belief in God. Does anybody think that today? No, because they took over the paideia. And we look at some of the other aspects of classical education. The last one, I'll talk about it down here at the bottom, is the synthesis. What we want to create, and I'll wrap up with this, is students who seek all the knowledge of Christ and conform to this knowledge. It's that simple. They spend their life learning the truth of Christ so they will know how to walk in its way, in his way, right? So this is the project we're about, but how does it work? Well, every aspect of a classical Christian school should be orbiting around this and around this concept of the slides I showed just before this, to find truth and teach kids how to find it. That's some schools in the classical movement will say we teach kids how to think, not what to think. Well, that's only half true, and half-truths tend to be lies, right? Satan was the master of half-truths. We teach them how to think and what to think, because the tradition of the Christian tradition gives us so much truth that you could never achieve at in a lifetime. Tradition matters. Original sources matter. That's why we read so many old books, is because we try and get back to, that is the basis. We want the students to know what to think, but we also want them to learn how to arrive at truth, how to understand. And that's the part that is true in that statement. So with that, I would say I didn't go into the nuts and bolts of classical education too much. I'll leave that for when that Forging the American Mind releases. If you really don't trust my assertions here and want to go dig into it and figure out exactly how it works in 3rd grade or 5th grade or 7th grade or whatever, you can check out the book.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like more information about Montana Christian Academy or classical Christian education, visit our website at montanachristian.com.